I want to start with a story from about 6 years ago or so. I was traveling with a team of physicians and educators in Haiti, in Les Cayes, Haiti. And it was the last day of a 10-day venture, roughly a 2-week trip. And we had to get up very early in order to get on a bus to ride for 4 or 5 hours to Port-au-Prince. And then from there we would fly to, I think it was Miami, and there from Miami to Chicago. So it was a long day, and it was a fraught day. It felt like every part of the day had these connection points that we had to make. If we didn't make the connection points, then the whole thing could fall apart. So we got up early with our suitcases, and we stood outside the compound residence hall, and we waited for the bus to come to take us to Port-au-Prince, and it didn't come. And it didn't come, and it didn't come. We had begun this whole planning process thinking that if we were even half an hour late, we might be in serious trouble, and the bus was an hour late. But finally, we heard that thing chugging up the hill. We clambered in and drove to Port-au-Prince. It was a very anxious trip. And I've often thought about the ways that our cultural frames, our habits of mind, made that an even more anxious trip than maybe it had to be. We made it to the airport in time. Maybe not with a lot of time to spare, but with some time to spare, and we made it back to Chicago as we had planned. But what I saw in evidence that day was two opposing ways of looking at time, two different ways of thinking about the passage of minutes and hours. There was something that was a recognizably Haitian understanding of time, and there was a recognizably North American understanding of time, and the two were somewhat in conflict that day. So during this quarantine, I've had a chance to read a book. I won't say it's been on my list for a long time, but I ran into it through a colleague, Dr. Knight Johnson. And the book is called Waking Up White. It's by Deborah Irving, and one of the benefits of shelter in place has been that I have a little bit more time to read books than I might otherwise. And I don't have a lot of places to go to. So Debbie Irving and I have become friends, a little bit of a one-sided friendship. But I ran into something in a chapter just recently that helped me to understand that experience in Haiti a little bit better. So the chapter was entitled The Dominant White Culture. And this is a very personal memoir-like book describing someone who is gradually coming to be acquainted with her own race, her own whiteness. And she is someone who's been involved in nonprofits, especially in the arts realm, in theater. And so she is asking questions like, why is it that no matter how hard we work, we can't get our organizations to diversify, especially ethnically? And she comes to a lot of answers to this question, but one of the answers that she comes to has to do with the theory that we're talking about this week, muted group theory. And I don't have the memory, the resources, or the experience to fully flesh out Debbie Irving's ideas about whiteness here. And some of what I'm going to say is a little bit rushed and a little bit, it's going to need qualification. So don't treat this like a theoretical claim. Treat it like something that is a probe, something that is an invitation to explore further. So she describes going to a lot of conferences, talking to a lot of ministers and social workers and educators and psychologists who are all in organizations that are trying to diversify. They're white dominant organizations, and they're trying to change up their demographic. And she's asking these people, like, what are the obstacles? And one of the obstacles she comes across is, quite frankly, whiteness and certain kinds of behaviors that are characteristic of white people, she says. And these behaviors can inhibit efforts to diversify organizations racially, ethnically. And so it's very interesting. She bullet points out perhaps 10 different white behaviors. I think of them as traits as well. Conflict avoidance, valuing formal education over life experience, having an entitlement, a sense of entitlement or a right to comfort, a sense of urgency, competitiveness, emotional restraint, judgmentalness, either or thinking, defensiveness, belief in one right way, being status oriented. So those are her bullet points of white behaviors that, according to the people she's talked to, inhibit organizations from diversifying racially. Now, I guess we have to give some qualifiers here. First of all, not all white people are conflict avoidant, or not all white people have a sense of urgency or are always on time for things. Not all white people are very status oriented. But it is interesting, isn't it, to think about ways that these qualities can be characteristic of white people. Of course, people of color might also have these traits, and Irving points out that for people who are in a minority population, it sometimes just makes good sense to internalize some of these traits for themselves. But as I thought about my experience in Haiti and our attitude towards time there as anxious North Americans, it really did seem like that sense of urgency, maybe even a sense of competitiveness and a sense of status, were helping to shape our experience of international travel there. Perhaps in some negative ways, perhaps in some not so helpful ways. I'd like to invite you to do some thinking about ways that whiteness, as described here by Irving, might be shaping some of your experience, whether you are a person of color or a person who is white. How is formal education, for instance, as a Trinity student? Remember the conversation between Devante and Douglas. Devante, not so interested in formal education. Douglas, very interested in formal education. How does that interact with life experience? How might emotional restraint, approaches to worship, for instance, or approaches to an argument or a really good critical conversation and discussion, how might the ways that your family sort of enculturated you into a certain kind of emotional restraint or a very emotional expressive habit be shaped by whiteness. I intend this to be more of a probe than an argued claim, something to think through and to contemplate and to look at in your own experience. I have to say, as I make my way down this bullet-pointed list, almost all of these do strike me as being characteristic of my own habits and traits and behaviors. And it is really provocative for me to think that perhaps these things are traceable to whiteness. This semester, we're thinking about intersections of race and social entrepreneurship. We're thinking about efforts of social entrepreneurs to be anti-racist and ways that they might even inadvertently be racist. And so this theory that we're discussing this week, muted group theory, has me pondering how might this theory focused on gender also help us to understand issues related to race? How might it be helpful for you as you're developing your theoretical claim at the semester's end? So today, thinking a little bit with Debbie Irving, it strikes me that the behaviors that she identifies as obstructive to organizations diversifying might be described in muted group terms as being muting. That is, they're obstructive because they mute people who are in low power groups within an organization. These habits, these traits, and these behaviors here of being kind of urgent all the time. I gotta be on time, and I gotta be early, and I gotta get things done on schedule. And also being competitive and being sort of status concerned and preoccupied with formal education, and practicing a certain kind of emotional restraint, never sort of letting your feelings show in any too overt of a fashion. These traits might mute other groups of people who don't have those traits, or for whom those traits are somewhat foreign. For instance, if you grew up in a family or in a culture in which a good, vigorous, outspoken, emotionally demonstrative argument or conversation, discussion, if that was integral to your household and to the way, I don't know, that your parents got along or people in your church got along, then to suddenly find yourself in an organization where moderation and careful rationality and a balanced tone of voice, all of that is normal and expected and is described as well-behaved, to find yourself suddenly in that setting, well, that might shut you down. That might mute you. So that's one example of a way that what Debbie Irving is describing here as sort of characteristically white behaviors, how they might serve to mute people of other groups. Thanks for thinking through these things with me.